One of the things I like to say at the beginning of my talks is just because I make jokes and try to liven things up doesn't mean I'm not deathly serious about my topic, which is why people do what they do with their plants. And so for all the people who have killed more plants than have survived, I put this slide up, and it's, of course, from Ingmar Bergman, one of the most depressing Swedish directors ever in the world. And this is what happens when you water your succulents too much. So I'm telling you, if you think it's thirsty, I'm telling you it's not. That's why there's succulents. Anyway, so here, let's be a little more formal. The landscape of community, and this is what I think of, well, it applies to even COVID. We think of ourselves in our own territory, but we are part of a larger community, and we have to work together to improve things. And in our case, of course, in California, that means trying to break ourselves of the slavery of having an English lawn, because, in case you hadn't noticed, we don't live in England. We live in the Central Coast with a Mediterranean climate in which grasses go dormant in the summer. And that would go a long way to making lawns sustainable if people didn't irrigate them all summer and keep them juvenile, if they let them go dormant and come back in the fall the way nature intended. So where did we start out? Well, the cradle of civilization for our Western culture is in the Mesopotamian area of the Middle East. Of course, we know that simultaneously there were agricultural developments in South America, in Australia, and in China, just to name a few. So agriculture arose several times in human societies. And one of the first things they did was build a wall or a fence or branches or something to keep out the animals that might be scavenging their crops. But very quickly, as society started to settle down and farm instead of wandering after the naturally ripening fruits and vegetables and seeds that were year-round in their habitat, they settled around a source of water, so a spring or a well, and this is the classic Babylonian estate with a well or a pool in the middle, surrounded by all productive plants. Ornament was not part of it until much later on. This was all about plants that gave you papyrus, if you had it, for fiber, fruit, oranges, citrus, all of which came from actually from the Far East, but were traded on the early trade routes into Western culture. So you had a garden to surround your property and to keep the animals out, and then of course to keep out some of the neighbors as well. And well, I mean, if your apples are ripening, what do you have to do? You have to guard them. So this was the model for early agriculture. It was one family or one tribal group around an oasis or a spring or a habitable place where they could still hunt on the outside, but stay at home safely on the inside. And if you look at the old Persian word for paradise, for Eden, which all came into our Judeo-Christian Bible, that word means, paradise means garden. It's a walled garden. And if you think about Adam and Eve in the Judeo-Christian Bible, they were expelled from the garden. So if they had been out in wild nature, they couldn't have been expelled because that was what there was. They were expelled for their sins from a garden. And so that is the basis of our cultural understanding that a garden provides everything we need in our lives, except perhaps animal protein. But if you have chickens and animals, then of course you can do that. So then racing forward about 4,000 years from 2000 BC here to the Middle Christian era, here we are in the Dark Ages, in which the gardens of Europe and North Africa kind of kept everything going. Some of them were monasteries where the monks were cloistered away and they tended all their crops. They weren't in for ornamentation, but you see here a herbal medicinal garden, some vegetables in the middle row, and then some grapes in the back row. And this was what got those monasteries through times of plague and disturbance all throughout Europe, and in fact, through the Western world. So part of our horticulture now is based on raising crops for our own use, and in times of plenty, raising enough to trade or sell or buy shoes or any of the early pre-money transactions that happened then. So we were rooted in horticulture, which now we use to mean not just ornamental horticulture, but things like trees and shrubs, so berry bushes and fruit trees. Horticulture tends to be based now on perennial crops, whereas our food crops, especially the grains, tend to be based on, of course, annual crops where the soil has to be prepared and the plants have to be seeded every single year. So perennial polyculture is part of our cultural history. So going forward from the Dark Ages, just a couple of centuries, all of a sudden, in spite of many, many wars across Europe, I mean, those were almost like tribal fights. So we think of them different from tribes in Africa or India or Australia, but these were really, small European tribes, each speaking a different language or dialect, and they had to protect themselves. But as soon as they had enough wealth, of course, with wealth comes ostentation. And so this is a great leap forward to the formal, geometric, mathematical-based gardens of the Renaissance. The Renaissance was a return to learning. First, the Arabs in North Africa, and then the monks in Europe, especially Ireland, had saved all the knowledge and copied all the books for centuries, for 800 years. And now the public was seeing them again. And the leaders here could put some money into ornamental horticulture. What did that mean? It meant I have more money than you do, and I can afford 57 gardeners on their hands and knees every day to maintain this landscape. Unfortunately for us, this manicured landscape is fixed in our minds, even for those of us who don't have 15 acres of manicured gardens. This is our ideal, having clipped shrubs and a green lawn. And the flowers here are almost secondary because you look, the whole structure is about geometry and clipping. So this is a labor-intensive but non-productive landscape. And that's now what we think about horticulture. Horticulture is ornamental. But I want you to be sure that even here in this Mediterranean climate, you can grow food, you can grow herbs, you can grow things year-round that do more than just look pretty. They can actually enhance your food or be your food. So part of our heritage is based in this idea of a very orderly garden. When you see a real estate description, they say well landscaped or well trimmed, which means a green lawn and shrubbery. But let us proceed. Here's a close-up, and I always liken this to roadkill because I have to stop and look at it. I love to go to formal gardens like this, but I do not do my pruning with nail clippers, and that's how this is done. And you'll notice once again, well, seriously, this is so overwrought. Look at those tiny little boxwood hedges, and they're just architecture. They're not really plants at all, except when one dies and then you have a hole in your hedge. But it's a fascinating landscape. Very few of us have the time, energy, or thank God, the inclination to do this kind of advanced, super ornamental horticulture. And I think most of us in California, if we live in our own climate, we will not be planting things like this, which require water year round. So here's the apotheosis, the Louis of France, here in the flat central French landscape. You'll see now that nature is entirely excluded. So we're back to that Babylonian garden. We have walls, and outside is the wilderness. In this case, it's forest. On the inside is manicured, and near the gardens have been reduced to carpets. They're like mosaics. They're not really about the plants. Once again, it's about the patterns on the ground and the geometry of the castle and the moat. So when they say a man's home or a woman's home is her castle, this is what they're talking about. It's a house that inspires awe and envy in all the neighbors, but with a fairly useless landscape all around it. And again, when I go to Europe, I have to go to these gardens, but I would never dream of wanting to own something like this, which really, it gives you nothing to eat. And it's meant to be enjoyed, of course, from the upper bedroom there in the castle while you're getting dressed in the morning. So meanwhile, as the Renaissance was getting rolling in Europe, European explorers, and we know that there were some before the Italians and the Portuguese and the Spanish. The Vikings had been there 500 years earlier, but they didn't leave anything, so therefore they don't get the credit. In any case, here's what the first settlers saw when they came to eastern US. Deep, deep forest full of plants they had no idea about. It was scary to them. There were thorns, there was poison ivy, and then when they went west, there was poison oak, all sorts of things they had never dealt with in their life. And so they thought of it as a scary place. Here's a much later painting from the 18th century, but you see, this is what people saw in the New World: dangerous plants and animals. And think about the Scarlet Letter, which all of us had to read in high school. I can't believe it. My kids never had to read it. But what happened in the Scarlet Letter? Did they go back to Arthur's place or Hester's place? No, they went to the forest. The forest was the witches hung out. The forest was where temptation was given into. The forest was wild nature at its worst, and God's message to us, to the Puritans especially, was to clean it up and make it productive. So this was regarded as improving the land, cutting down the native vegetation, replacing it with crops. And for those of you who are tidy, I have one child like this where the peas can't touch the gravy and can't touch the mashed potatoes, right? You want crops that don't touch each other. Unfortunately, this is also carried into our gardening now, where we believe that plants shouldn't touch. Each one has to be lined up like a row of tomatoes or a row of corn, even if they're ornamental. So back in England, another 200 years, now we're in the 1800s, that French ideal, that French, Italian, Spanish formal garden ideal was a little harder to keep up with in England with all its rain. And they had a romantic movement which went back to a kind of artificial or constructed nature. So here's one of the big castles, I think it's Stowe in Britain, where they had taken out all those terraces. They actually had them for 100 years, but they took them all out, planted natural sweeps of trees. They dammed up the streams to make lakes. And now we had open lawns surrounded by trees, much more native. Plus which, at the same time, here came the Industrial Revolution, when all of a sudden, the small farmers who were really just sharecroppers were pushed off the land. The little walls were torn down. This was all opened up for grass to grow the sheep, to produce the wool that went to the factories that were the first major development in the Industrial Revolution, was factories to clean and card and spin wool into thread and then to make fabric. And so that gave rise to the slave trade in a triangle with Europe, America, and back to Europe again, where the slaves were brought from Africa to America. They would grow the sugar and the cotton. The sugar was made into rum, and the cotton went back to England. It was made into fabric, and the fabric was traded as far as India and China. So based on this idea of a lawn that was also a sheep meadow, the English Industrial Revolution soon made England the preeminent power in the world. And so the lawn here is not just ornamental, it is a production. It is a pasture for all those sheep. And here's a close-up. There are some sheep in the background. This lawn that I visited a few years ago has never been fertilized, and it's not all grass. It has 43 different species. That lawn has been there for 300 years, almost 400 years now, without ever being fertilized, because it has legumes, it has clovers in it. So it is actually ecologically sound. Also the fact that until the last couple of decades, it rained every day. So this is where a lawn belongs, or maybe even Seattle. But, you know, we have to think about where we live. There are parts of the East Coast and upper Midwest that are amenable to lawns as they were conceived in England. Of course, they're not used for pastures. Now we have to mow them. And here's what happened in America. O.M. Scott in Ohio, in Marysville, Ohio, was playing around with prairie grasses until he could find bunch grasses that grew out, that filled in. And while he came up with that, the fabric factories in England, remember those? They had these spinning blades that cut off the tops of loops and made velvet. So how did they make velvet? They did they wove a fabric with all these little loops and they mowed off the top and it became velvet. And so somebody at that point adapted these huge velvet cutting spinners into a hand-drawn model, which became a lawnmower. So you hitched up the mule or you hitched up your wife and she would drag it around the lawn while you went behind her mowing the grass. So all of a sudden you could have a lawn without grazing animals. And this is a breakthrough moment for the American landscape. Why am I not going down? Come on.
You might have to click on the application.
What's going on here? There. All right. So then, in very quick order, O.M. Scott and lawn grasses from Ohio met up with the lawn mower from England, and starting in the 1840s and 50s, this is the future of American parks. Everything from the Fenway in Boston to Central Park in New York to Golden Gate Park in San Francisco. You have an open meadow with grass, loose plantings of trees and shrubs, and as you get toward the edge of it, it becomes more formal. So if you think about the Metropolitan Museum in New York, it's in Central Park, but it's exactly this kind of layout. Big meadow, and in Brooklyn, their Frederick Law Olmsted Park is called the Sheep Meadow. even though there hasn't been a sheep on it in 300 years. So this was the ideal for American landscape, open lawn, edged with trees. And we kept on developing this through our towns. So when Europeans came to the US in 1850 through 1900, they thought every city and town was a garden city because they were united by these lawns. So shady avenues and trees, lots of room, unlike those cramped medieval cities of Europe where you had to live outside the city in order to have a garden or a lawn. Here we were in America where everybody had a lawn and a garden, and now it was important to keep up with the neighbors. And I don't mean by buying a new car, putting in a swimming pool. You kept up with the neighbors by treasuring your lawn. And the City Beautiful movement of the 1890s went across America, well-meaning people saying it was your civic duty to have a well-mowed lawn like a carpet of velvet green. And those were the words they used. And so now we're in a situation barely 150 years later where it doesn't matter if you cheat on your taxes or beat your children, as long as your grass is green, you're a good neighbor. And a good Christian, right? I mean, we're so obsessed, and you know Americans are like this. We had a neighbor in Florida who edged 3 times a week. We called him Lawnmower Man. I mean, I couldn't believe it. You'd get home from work and you'd hear him fire up that edger and go around his sidewalks and driveway 3 times a week. Well, it was Florida. It was ugly. And here's the first suburbs. Again, Midwest, not Eastern Coast. This is Riverside. This is 1869, Frederick Law Olmsted, the same company that did the Golden Gate Parks and all the major parks in all the American cities. Here we are at Riverside, and it's a subdivision. Look, you can see the single family houses, and then you have the rail. You have the light rail and the road down the middle. So you have horse and carriage traffic as well as rail traffic. Along there, you have the apartments. We would call them condos now, and also where the help lived. So right on the transportation line, you had the commerce and the laborers living, and then farther out, you had these subdivisions. And if you can see, there's golf courses. Well, they're not exactly golf courses, but they turned into golf courses later. Now, when you have condos, you have a golf course. But my point here is that the lawn unified this whole thing, and you needed to have a lawn. Otherwise, you were an outcast. I mean, it was that serious. But what's wrong with this? What's wrong with a native lawn? Beginning in the 60s and 70s, people, again in the Midwest, a woman in Minneapolis was taken to court after the city had cut down her meadow. She didn't want to mow grass. She wanted to grow wildflowers. But the city fathers decided, of course, that attracted vermin, and it wasn't attractive. You know, it wasn't nice. You had to have a clipped lawn instead of having native lupins like we have here on the Central Coast. So now we have this conflict between what nature asks us to do and what our social contract asks us to do. The social contract says lawn. Nature says mixed species. And
interesting lecture from the director of the Arboretum, talking about the history of how
I'll try and get that.
Of how gardens came, and that we were constantly having
Somebody here.
lawns and manicured things.
Okay, I was able
Somebody has to unmute or mute.
I muted her.
Okay, great. Anyway, so here we are with a native meadow, and this is perfectly fine, but this is the Midwest, and I love this picture because aside from no leaves on the trees, you can't even tell what season it is. You know, you've got 1 acre or 3 of lawn, and you have what we call a foundation planting. And I appeal to you ladies, how many of you still wear foundation garments? Not too many. The corsets should, you know, the lawns should go the way of corsets. We don't need them. So you see this foundation planting, it has to be evergreen. They planted big shrubs too close to the house, so they're getting too big. You see on the left side, they had to cut out that row and plant new ones because they're getting too big. And of course, this little shrub here off to the right is trying to escape, but I'm sure they tracked it down because it's ruining the lawn. You know, you have to have an open lawn. And don't think I'm emphasizing this too much. So this went into the public landscape. Here's another one in Ohio, a public building. But does this look like a public landscape? This is a residential landscape with dinky little shrubs around the edges and a lawn in the middle. It doesn't do much for civic pride at all. Plus which we have the ubiquitous mulch, and we'll talk about mulch later. So we all claim to be environmentalists, but what do we do with our own property? If we believe in the environment, in pollinators, in fruit, in sustainability, why do we cling to a model of a residential landscape that doesn't belong in our climate. And that's the problem, because California was largely settled, well, almost totally settled by European-based people who came from the East Coast. They were used to this kind of thing, but instead of adapting to the landscape we live in, we brought our habits with us. And when you look at the development of Los Angeles, how much endless quantities of water are being spent on green lawns and golf courses in a climate that just really does not sustain that kind of thing. So let's think about our landscape. Here's one where they gave up on grass, and this is fake grass. And in fact, you know, I used to think all fake grass, astroturf, and they have some really good ones now, I have to say, but it doesn't look natural, but it doesn't need water either. It's easy to clean. If the dog poops on it, you know, you can just pick it up. So this is a Western adaptation of the Eastern landscape. Once again, a fairly useless foundation planting all around the edges, not in the middle. No, the lawn takes the middle. The landscape is just around the edges, but at least this one is a little bit more sustainable than the next one. Wait a second, I skipped ahead here. I'll go back to that one. Here's a project I worked on when I was a professor in Florida. Here was your typical Florida lawn. Again, look at all the shrubs packed against the windows. You know, that's not good design. If you want to screen something, you put the screen at the outer edge of your property. You don't put it in front of your face and say, oh, you can't see me. Anyway, this was unsustainable, plus all the chemicals, the pesticides and the fertilizers washed right down the street and into Florida, which is mostly wetlands, before the white folks started draining it all down. So this one was then changed to this landscape. Same houses, same neighborhood, native grasses out by the road. And do you know what made this work? It wasn't that these grasses were so beautiful, which they are. What made this work is we left some lawn in. That was the cue to care. So the yards are united not by lawn out to the street, but by lawn threading through the front yards that allowed people to pull the shrubs away from the house and make the pedestrian way more attractive while not blocking their own view. So this is one way of reducing lawn without eliminating it. And this satisfied most people. Having some lawn was enough to make them feel good about their house. And then we have this lovely house. This is when you use shrubs and vines to decorate your landscape. And particularly here, this is all about the mailbox. And this is actually in my neighborhood. And one of these days, somebody's going to jump on me for doing this, but it's here in Aptos if you want to see it in person. I don't know how many of you are nodding your head or shaking your head with dismay, but to me, this is so much effort. And for what? You know, gravel and some tortured shrubs with that poor mailbox hidden in the middle. So think about what you do. Where do we live? We live in a place that can have flowers and color and growing things all year round. How lucky are we to live in a Mediterranean climate? Instead, we treat it like an Eastern climate. Even the stores, the nurseries, the box stores, they talk about winter and spring and autumn as if we have 4 seasons like Minnesota or something. We don't. We have a wet season and a dry season. But there are plants that will bloom, fruit, flower, and grow all year round. And there's no reason to have a landscape that is static, that is boring. Oh, here's a Florida one. This is mulching. Mulch is a good thing. Mulch is the underwear of the landscape. Mulch is underneath the ground cover, underneath the plants. Mulch should not be the permanent part of the landscape, because think about it, bark mulch or any other organic mulch will break down. So it looks the best the day it goes in. It's all downhill from there. And weeds love mulch just as much as your plants do. So you're not really saving anything. And so if you want mulch, and I have my entire back garden in gravel, but it's full of plants. So the gravel is an easy to care for, easy to weed, easy to deal with. And I don't have to worry about the mulch breaking down, blowing away, rotting, and all that. So again, this is a fairly sad little landscape. And these people put a lot of time and effort into this. That's what they got. So here's a better solution. This is a little heavy, but if you're thinking about fire-wise, you need to, if you're anywhere near where natural fires can come or embers could blow, so even several miles in from the forest edge, you need to think about reducing fuel, but you can do that with a lush landscape. So here's a Western landscape It's probably here on the central coast because you can see the Italian cypress and the palm peeking up behind the house. But there's that salvia in front. This could actually be in Santa Cruz. It's wonderful. It's got ground cover, so you have the lawn-like effect, and it's got colorful shrubs that have some seasonality, fall colors, spring blooms, the whole thing. So this is a composed landscape, but it looks more natural. Everything's not pushed against the house. And of course, you do not have a golf course style lawn running out to the curb. I want to say something about native plants, and I'll harp on this a little bit more later. When people say native plants, I always have to go into school marm mode and I say, native to what? Oh, well, native California plants. Well, okay, I get a wetland plant from Watsonville, from the slough. I get a couple of shrubs from the Sierra. I go up north and get some huckleberries from Northern California, and then I get some cactus from the Mojave, and I put them all together. And they all need different care. They don't go well with each other. They're all native California plants. So what makes it so magic to have them called a native plant garden? Native is local. Native is local. If you want to help the local pollinators, plant plants that are native to your area. And that takes a little bit more work. For one thing, the nurseries don't often supply native plants based on where they came from. They sell them on, how much they flower. Anyway, this picture is in Spain. It's in Barcelona. This is one of the old botanic gardens, and that is Monterey cypress. So that is one of our native shrubs or trees. And here it is, pruned to a fairly well. And Monterey cypress is kind of trashy. It grows fast. Unless it's near the coast where it's sculpted and all that, that's when Monterey cypress are beautiful. If you plant them inland, like in my backyard, well, past my backyard, they grow into gigantic trees which drop limbs all the time. And then the limbs start dying. So they're really not long-lived sustainable trees in the general landscape, but here they're growing happily enough in Spain, or in Spain. I was going to say Portugal, they use them there too. You see Monterey cypress around the world. It's amazing because that Monterey cypress is native to the Monterey Peninsula, period. And it's been planted up and down the coast. But in Mediterranean climates around the world, in Australia, they have walls of it, 20, 30 feet high. So native is meaningless unless it's locally native to your soil type, your rainfall, your area, your exposure. So there's no magic in buying native California plants unless you live in the same kind of habitat that those plants are native to. Now, luckily, the coastal chaparral, the coastal prairies are full of wonderful things that you can plant in your garden, and they look appropriate in your garden. But you can't take plants from all over California and say they're native. Again, native to what is the question you should ask. If it's native to coastal chaparral, if it's native to the Central Valley, they have different conditions that they respond to, whether it's heat or cold, or whether it's soil chemistry. You need to know before you start throwing the word native around like it's meaningful. I hope you're all chastened and humbled. No, I mean, I admire people who want to do things that are sustainable and appropriate, but you have to go the extra step. Just slapping a native label on it means nothing. It's all about where the plant evolved, what conditions it needs to do its best. Now, you can also, native plants don't have to be planted in native settings. You don't have to do a wild, lousy garden that looks untidy, especially if you're a neat freak. Let's go back to those Renaissance gardens. This is manzanita. These are these little creeping manzanitas. So instead of boxwood, which is kind of finicky, this is a native, it's Manzanita edmondsii, which is a ground cover manzanita. It's native slightly farther down the coast, but it's perfect. If you want to do clipped effects, use a native plant that will take to it. Right? You can do that. So there's no rule that says native plant gardens have to be all wild and scary and look dead half the year. You can find evergreen plants, you can find flowering plants, but you have to do a little bit of homework. And I have yet to see any nursery coming out saying, here we are. Imagine going to Home Depot and they have a section in the garden area that says native to California's Central Coast, where you could go and all the plants there, from Dudleya's to Doug firs, and they were all appropriate for this area. You don't find that. You find the same shrubs in Tennessee and Miami as you do in California and Colorado, because the big box stores are shipping from all over the country and around the world. Here's a native plant garden in Florida. It's not particularly tidy, but it's native palms, native shrubs, native ground covers. It looks nice. And these people are not out there mowing every day or edging 3 times a week. Here's a native garden, which is not successful. This also is the wedding cake garden, where you just make arbitrary circles and line them up and put plants in rows. This is the least attractive part of the Ladybird Johnson Wildflower Garden. If you're ever in Texas, in Austin, you have to go to Ladybird Johnson. The entire garden is native Texan plants. Most of them are displayed beautifully. Unfortunately, this garden is not beautiful. It's just weird to me. But again, Ladybird Johnson is one of the most successful gardens to be all native to its environment. Here, however, you have to go to Santa Barbara. Santa Barbara, you can go down to LA. There are a couple of fabulous public gardens that are all native as well, but Santa Barbara is 100% native to the Central Coast, and that's kind of the southern edge of our climate thing. You go south of Santa Barbara, then you're in the LA basin, and now you're in desert as opposed to true Mediterranean. Here's the cupcake planting, where you put the candle in the middle of the cupcake and put some edging around it. I never understand. This is a way for people to enhance their lawn. So you have that curb around the back, and again, your useless foundation planting, and then this poor tree. And when people do this, they tend to drown their roots because they're piling soil up against the trunk, not just the roots. So these are harder to maintain, and there's no need. This is gilding the lily. You're putting too much in there. And this is my very favorite. We went down to Home Depot and we bought some retaining things, and we put in this planter, and then we put a bush in it, and we called it a day. So I don't know. You decide, is this how you want your garden to look? I mean, it's fine to build retaining walls. You can use natural rock, you can use pavers, but let's think about filling this up with plants and not making the mulch the main event here. And this is another problem with this mulch. This will be full of weeds in a couple of months. So these poor people, until that rhododendron grows, which if it's here in Santa Cruz, it might not, they're just going to be weeding this round little patch. So how do we fight against invasive plants and weeds? We don't need herbicides if we preempt it. If we fill those holes, if we put stuff we want in those gaps, then the plants will grow together. This is what I mean about plants touching. That's why you don't see native landscapes full of undesirable plants, because the plants are growing so they touch, they make shade, they crowd out the weeds that would get going underneath them. So if you really want to be sustainable, you can't plant one plant here and another plant there. And you know, many people lay out their gardens. You see it, especially with new real estate, when they plant, the developers put the garden and they put in 7 things in the front yard, 7 plants. And it's like M&Ms on a plate. They're not composed. You know, there's these little isolated things, and, you know, 3 grasses that look like little brooms, and they call that a landscape. A landscape is composed, whatever the motif, whether it's formal or tropical or garden-esque. And then we have berms. Here's another problem. Berms are not natural except in glacier country. Berms are the channels of dirt that are left behind when the glaciers melted. And they're not natural at all. Here they drop some petrified pterodactyl eggs on it to make it look more natural. But if you want to screen, do evergreens, and do evergreens that grow to the ground. Here's another problem. People don't know what they're planting. They get a pine tree and they plant it like this. Well, you know, pine trees, as they grow, they lose their branches. So in 10 years, you're going to be able to see right through here to whatever they were trying to screen. And then one more word about the ugliness of mulch. You see how happy those weeds are? They love mulch too. So what would make this successful? Half the height of the berm, plus which, if we have water issues, why would you make a slope where water runs off? What you need is basins, not hills, if you want to keep your water on your property. So this is a very misguided attempt to screen a front yard from a busy road, but they could have done it so much more effectively with plant materials instead of dirt. Here's a native planting I did in Colorado years ago. They wanted berms, but do you see the piles of dirt? No, you don't. I used boulders, native scrub oak, native asters from the prairies around. And so this is a very successful landscaping using 100% local native plants and year-round color. This is fall, so the asters are blooming and the oaks are turning yellow. Grasses are great. Grasses are wonderful. And when you plant grasses, the rule is grasses in masses. You never see a single grass plant growing alone by itself. They need to touch, they need to sway in the wind. You have to think about grasses in multiples. You know, just one or two specimens of a grass looks weird. Like some people have one giant pampas grass in the middle of their garden, right? It's unnatural. Whereas if you had a, well, remember the pampas grass and some of their relatives from southern South America are quite invasive here on the Central Coast. They're just enough at home to take, look at the California freeway system. You know, you can see the history of native plants from ice plant to pampas grass to acacia that's taking over the Bay Area. All of those were well-intentioned plantings that took off through the landscape. And they're bad, especially you drive up to Felton, you know, all the acacia, and they've been cutting it for the last couple of years, but it's really hard to get ahead of a very active invasive plant like acacia. If you do grasses, and look, here's two species, they look lovely, put them in the sun. Grasses like sunshine. So, oh, it's a native grass, it should do well here. Well, you know what? It's not in a native situation. It's under an overhanging building, and they are not happy at all. The species on the left is going to live another year, but the species on the right is dying this year. And this is a new planting. And when I talked to the landscape architect, they said, well, they're grasses and they're native. Like that was the magic. So I know I'm being redundant, but I want you to think about, what does native mean? It's not to a state. Here's a garden that's fun. It's totally productive. This is based on a medieval garden. Each little square has its own crop. You see in the little flat yellow one, that's some seedlings coming up. You've got some onions or garlic coming up in the middle one. And that wonderful arbor in the back is hops. You know, hops for beer. Hops are interesting. Here's your factoid for the day. Hops are the only other genus or species that we use in the family Cannabaceae. So Cannabaceae includes marijuana or cannabis and hops, and that's what you get the musky scent from in beer. That must is the same chemical that you smell in marijuana. So, and that's why beer makes you sleepy, because it has some of the same properties. But my point here is you can do a structured garden, whether it's native plants are introduced or whether it's vegetables or cut flowers. You can subdivide your garden into tiny plots, which gives it some order. So if one is empty for a couple of months, you see there one on the far left corner, it's empty right now. It's got some seeds waiting to come up. But when you have it laid out formally like this, you can get away with an empty spot because it's obvious that there's something else coming up and it's not just unused acres. And then if you want a lawn effect, you don't have to plant a lawn. This is a Miami garden, I think. It's either Miami or San Diego. I can't remember. Oh, it's got hills. It's San Diego. Miami is flat, but it's just a seaside terrace. We have so many of these around here. They wanted a lawn effect, but they didn't have enough area for a lawn. So they put in this liriope, which is called mondo grass. It's not a grass, it's a little liliaceous thing. But how effective is that? It gives the feeling of a lawn, but it's like an area rug instead of wall-to-wall carpet. And that's what I like to think of lawns as, area rugs. They can be a focus point. If you have dogs or kids, you want some lawn, but it shouldn't be the default ground covering. Here's Lady Bird Johnson again. This is a native watering hole, you know, that sweet water of East Texas. It's wonderful. There are only 7 plants in this fountain. And it's native rock and native plants, and it looks perfectly natural here, even though it's very composed and very constructed. So again, native plants can be used for more formal effects. Rain gardens, not so much, not around here. For one thing, they're hard to maintain without turning into little swamps and bogs. So you can do a water feature, but it's better to keep open water out of your garden because it's going to be filled with algae before you can figure. Here's a grassy landscape. This one obviously is a very expensive swimming pool with a black granite bottom and some really expensive rock work. But look at the composition here. Huge billowing grasses, and that's it. You know, the lawn is often another place where they actually use it, but this pool is surrounded by landscaping. I think it's highly effective. And then we have gardens like the Arboretum, where you really must come. I assume all of you are members and that you all come at least every 6 weeks, but you need to come to the Arboretum. If you want to see plants from California and from the other Mediterranean zones of the world, we've got them at the Arboretum, and we're shifting our collections now to anticipate what the climate changes are going to be. And we expect them things to be hotter and drier. So our Australian collections are going to emphasize Western Australia, where it's hotter and drier. And I want to do a North African garden because we have a South African garden. It looks just like Santa Barbara. I mean, it's the same climate as Santa Barbara, but we're going to be getting drier. And so we need to come up with plants that will work there. And South Africans and Australian plants are perfect for Santa Cruz. You've got to come to the garden and see these mature blooming shrubs that have no irrigation, decades with no irrigation, and they're healthy and lush. And we like the word lush, unless you're a minimalist. So come up to the garden. So landscape design should concern itself with maximizing single species, less with maximizing single species performance than with creating healthy plant communities. Now, we all know we've killed plants, right? There was a famous landscape gardener who once said, I consider every new plant fully hardy until I have killed it myself. Because that's how we learn, right? We've all killed plants. Sometimes something has to die. You know, when my kids were little, I would leave them at the nursery and drive the plants home first and then come back and get the kids. And when I got my plants home, I would look around and say, I need some space here. Somebody's got to die. But they don't have to die. You can give them away. And I do that all the time. If something's gotten too big or I decide I don't really like it there, I'll dig it up and give it away. You can do that. So if your plant is dying, don't just watch it die. If you can't fix it, give it to someone who can. And so plant rescue is a good thing. Think about your garden as a plant community. Think about it from ground cover to herbaceous plants to woody shrubs to trees. All those different types of plants work together in harmony. And you can do it with natives and you can do it with mixed. Now, I'm too greedy as a gardener. I want one of everything. So I tend to have plants from all over the world packed into a very small garden. Here's the Arboretum Overview. As you should know, it's right where High Street becomes Empire Grade, up the hill from Mission Street. And we are at the southern end of campus with our own entrance right on High Street. You do not have to get lost on campus to come to the Arboretum. And we encourage you all to do so. We have free days once a month on Tuesdays, but otherwise admission is very reasonable. We're the cheapest entry admission of any garden in the Bay Area, and it's worth your time. Here's the classic California landscape from the 50s and 60s, swimming pool, lawn, and a rock. And this is not bad. The only thing I would do is have something other than grass, because obviously nobody's grazing here. It's not a big lawn for people to play on. This is just space filler. So why not some blooming ground cover? Or in fact, why not 3 different species of blooming ground cover? There's nothing wrong with the festuca, this bluegrass here, but to me, rather than be serene, it's kind of boring. I know this is supposed to be simple and effective, but I think if you have the luxury of just a few square feet of dirt, I mean soil, we're gardeners, we don't say, you know, bushes or dirt, we say shrubs and soil now because we're refined. Use it, it's there for you. So here's my idea of a backyard. It's easier than lawns. You've got these salvias, and this is heaven. Here we are in Santa Cruz. Heaven, there's a collection at Cabrillo. We're working on a collection at the Arboretum. The stores here are full of salvias, and many of them will actually bloom year-round. The thing with salvias is they like to be whacked back regularly. They'll get fresh, they bloom on fresh growth. So here's rock roses, salvias, and one focal point, and that adds a touch of formality. As untamed and curvy as this landscape looks, that one pot in the background, and it doesn't have to have water and it doesn't have to have lights on it, but a focal point in your garden organizes your view and it attracts you down this lovely path. So that's my idea of a maintenance-free garden, not one that's all mulch, so there's nothing to maintain, because remember, the weeds love mulch just as much as the other plants do. If you want to fill space and avoid weeds, then fill your space with plants that you want. So I did a little talk for several fire resistant seminars, and I just wanted to show you the difference between native and exotic plants and how they can both work in the landscape similarly to be fire resistant. So you want low fuel. Once again, you don't plant anything tall against your house. Obviously here, agaves, all from northern Mexico up into Southern California. On the right, you have ceanothus, many, many lovely, lovely species of ceanothus. And they're so beautiful. That blue is unreal. My problem with ceanothus is it doesn't bloom long enough. you really only get 6 or 8 weeks from most of them. But when they're in bloom, they're worth it. Then we have the California fuchsia, which is not fuchsia. It is now in the epilobium, same as fireweed. That blooms in the fall. I've got one going mad outside in my front yard right now, the California fuchsia. And then potentilla, which is a prairie species, and it blooms throughout the entire spring, summer, fall season. It takes a little bit of break in the rainy season. Here's shade natives. You can use wild ginger in deep, deep shade. They make a dense ground cover and have really cute little flowers, but you have to get on your knees for that. Several species of Oregon grape. The fruits are edible. The flowers are brilliant yellow. They're related to barberries, so they have that same yellow flower. There are all sorts of California ferns, and unlike most people's belief, there are ferns that can grow in a dry landscape. Some of them go dormant, some of them actually stay green. The California wood fern and some of the others look really great. So if you have part shade to full shade, it doesn't have to be bare mulch. I'm always so distressed when I see a shade tree with no other plants underneath it, because that's not natural. All you're going to get is weeds. And then, of course, there's the California iris, Iris douglassiana. It will grow under live oak trees. It will grow under dense shade, and it blooms like mad in the spring with those beautiful blue flowers. So that's a suite of 8 plants that are native for common landscape uses. But what about exotics? We want the same effect. Here are some aloes and aeoniums. They're both from Africa. The aeoniums from the Atlantic Islands off Africa, and the aloes from Southern Africa. And they have that rosette, so they resemble agaves, but they're a little softer. And of course, they have beautiful, beautiful flowers. And then next to it is grevillea from Australia. It's a ground cover. It's woodier than that California fuchsia, and it blooms all year round, and the hummingbirds like it. So here's a ground cover that attracts pollinators. It keeps the hummingbirds happy, and it's fantastic. Then we have the salvia below that. Salvia is in the mint family, so it grows like crazy. Some salvias can become weedy, but they're tough as nails. Again, you just have to cut them down probably twice a year. I do mine twice a year to get more bloom and to make the plants healthier. And then I put these daylilies in there because these are hybrids that were adapted from southeastern US native, but they bloom all year round in this climate. Then we have exotics for the shade: winter creeper, euonymus, the grevillea medusa. It's like some of the other, we have for sale at the Arboretum 3 different grevillea ground covers. They're so dense that weeds can't come up through them, and they bloom almost all year round, 11 months out of the year. This acacia cousinette, which looks lush and it looks like it's getting watered all the time, but it's just an acacia with some funky habits, and it's just a glossy green foliage that you cannot beat in a dry landscape. And then here's another salvia, just to emphasize the point. You can get months and months and months of bloom from your salvias. Salvias, sages. Sage is the common name for salvia. And remember, everything is a salvia, or not really, but mint, rosemary, all of those are in the same family. Square stems, you know, little snappy flowers. Here's my backyard, just to show that I'm walking the walk and talking the talk. It's colorful all year round. There's the gravel for the paths and gravel for the mulch, so the garden kind of blends into it. I built up the walls by digging down the paths, so I didn't have to bring in any soil or take any away. And because most of these are succulents, you're seeing some flowering shrubs, except for that orange aloe on the left top. But this is colorful all year round with 0 maintenance. I have 3 weeding times a year. You know, after the spring rains, midsummer when other things have popped up, and then going into fall, I do a total cleaning on the garden. But that's 3 solid days of weeding in the entire year. No mowing and very little pruning, although pruning is essential. So that should be your inspiration, and I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. I'm going to open up so that we can see all the people here.
All right, and I'm going to shut my screen down here.
Okay, so we've got a lot of people, but we've had good luck with people just asking their questions. So if you have a question for Martin, unmute yourself and ask. Well, let me do a quick one to start with. So been a big move to succulents with our dryness, but in a way they're not really native to this area, but do they really do well? Your agave collection, et cetera, is spectacular at the Arboretum.
They all do well. Now, remember, we do have some native succulents. There's crassula, there's dudleya, there's sedums. We do have some native succulents, but they're not as big or as colorful as some of the exotic ones. But if you start going south toward Mexico or into the desert a little bit, but for the most part, I would say, if you want plants adapted to this climate, you don't have to stick with natives. There are succulents from around the world, and they are spectacular. The euphorbias and aloes of South Africa are not to be beat. And you see those giant aloe bushes around the town, but there's so many more species. There's dozens, hundreds of aloe species, all the way from the aloe vera to something else. In any case, so you can mix the succulents, and all my gardens are mixed. You know, South Africa's next to Australia because they're the same Mediterranean climate, and they just do beautifully. You cannot go wrong with succulents, except people who assume, oh, I haven't watered it in a month, it must be thirsty. And once again, I'm telling you, it's not thirsty. That's why they're succulent. So beware.
What about Scots Valley, which is inland? Is it basically the same?
Basically the same, except it gets closer to freezing more often than we do down on the coast. So the very narrow coastal edge, even though it's chilly from the water, it doesn't seem hard. Scots Valley, there are still South Africans and natives that can take the cold, but when you get higher up, when you're going up into Felton and farther, then you get hard freezes. And that's what keeps out a lot of the other Mediterranean climates. Mediterranean climates usually exist around the coast with a hot continent and a cold ocean. Think about the 5 areas around the world, and that's how they are. So in any case, if you're inland, if you're Scots Dindy Nose, there are some things that do beautifully here, and then 10 miles up there, they will not make it through the winter. Yeah. So again, be careful. There are native California plants that won't make it in Scots Valley either. So again, just planting natives is not the only answer. You have to look for plants that like the conditions that you live in, not what your friends downtown have or your friends in Minneapolis have. You need to choose plants that will grow in your situation.
So Cindy's iPad has a hand up.
Yeah.
Thank you. Martin, do you do workshops on the Arboretum for education?
I used to. We're so understaffed right now, and especially with the COVID, but as we come out of programming, I want to do more seminars and workshops if I can reach a bigger crowd, but I'd like to do it at the Arboretum and bring some plants in and show people. So it's one thing for me to be dabbling here on the screen and show you some pretty pictures, but I would like people to be able to come up and see how I would go about choosing plants to go together, even if they're not native to one certain area, but plants that have the same conditions. That's your watchword as a gardener. The plants should be adapted to the same conditions. You can't have a wetland plant next to an alpine plant next to a prairie plant because they want different water and different treatment. So yes.
And do you have talent? Do you have talent? I know you do have people who are knowledgeable, can speak to questions about the succulents and appropriate plantings.
Right.
Yeah.
And we have a new program going. The Monterey Bay Master Gardener Group has now started giving us volunteers. So we have our gift shop open with the plants, and we've tripled our plant sales area and doubled our nursery area. So we have more plants than we've ever had before for sale. But now we have these master gardener coming as docents to stand around in Norris and talk to people about plants. So the cashiers are over, and we have excellent local gardeners who can tell you about the plants before you buy them and kill them.
Okay.
I live in Santa Cruz, but also in Reno, and I have a new Reno place that needs major renovation garden-wise.
I'm sure.
This is so wonderful to know, but how would I find out both what it is in terms of its climate compared? I don't think it's Mediterranean.
No. It's
desert or something, but how would I find out this kind of information?
Well, it's all available online, actually.
What's that?
It's available online. What you need to do is go to University of Nevada Reno, not Las Vegas,
Right.
and see if they do horticulture and they have lists. I don't know if they have extension in Nevada the way we do in most states, but they might. In any case, there are plant lists available for the Reno Basin. There is almost nothing from the Central Coast that is going to grow in Reno. But there are many lovely plants, and there's some really good nurseries too. There's some tree and shrub nurseries down in Gardnerville and Minden, just south of Carson City, where they have terrific plants. So your palette will be more limited than here, but it can be spectacular. A high mountain desert is a wonderful place to garden.
Thank you.
But nothing from here.
That's what I was afraid of. I got lots of grass and it's dying, and it needs a lot of water.
No, you don't need grass.
I know. That's what you just told me. I just don't know what else to put in there.
There are manzanita ground covers. Actually, there are manzanitas that you can get out of the Sierra that will do beautifully and make a low evergreen ground cover.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Can you recommend succulents that would be good at holding a hillside of grass or of sand?
Well, that's hard. Almost nothing will hold sand if the rain is heavy enough. What you really want to do is not think about the roots holding it so much, because the roots tend to go down and be under. They don't go straight down. Most roots are under the surface, but far enough where they're not going to hold the surface. So when you have a sandy slope, the best way to do it is with a dense ground cover. It breaks up the rain, it breaks the velocity, and it grows tight enough against the soil. So again, some of the native manzanitas, whether you want it ankle high or knee high or waist high, are great. A lot of the grevilleas, the Australian grevilleas, which bloom 11 months of the year in this climate, they're perfect for holding hillsides because they're dense enough to break down the force of the rain. And so any water that does go through trickles into the sand before it starts racing. The worst thing is exposed sand, because then, both wind and water will make it move downhill. So think in terms of ground cover.
Are those terribly flammable?
No. They have low fuel. The things that are flammable are the bushes like arborvitaes that build up lots of dead stuff in the middle, where you have all the green on the outside and you've got all these old dead twigs and leaves in the middle. And it's natural. The plant is healthy, but it only really is growing on the outside. Those are the ones that people use for foundation plantings and that are just kindling for the house to go up because they've got so much fuel in them. But if you go to ground covers, especially the grevillea ground covers, they're so short that there's no fuel value at all. They won't carry a fire.
Do we have a listing? Ms. Constantine, do we have here a listing of the proper plants to plant in all our microclimates that we have from the university, or where could we get that?
Well, you can put it together pretty early. Actually, you know what you should do? Sunset Western Garden Book. They have lists of things for each, whether it's dry shade or moist shade, or dry sun or moist sun, and especially deer-resistant plants. Sunset Garden Book is still one of the best easy references for specialized plants for microclimates.
Okay, thank you.
Roger, unmute.
Okay, I'm unmuted. I just wonder if you could comment on ice plant, which is another kind of strange thing that was put in with old theories, as far as I know, about what beaches should look like and should look like. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, it was put in as a ground cover and an erosion control because it grows so densely that it does break up any rainfall. And it's ironic. Ice plant has become invasive on the entire California coast until you get so far it's too cold for it. And it's a great plant for stabilizing slopes. However, it grows so dense, it crowds out all the native species. So now there's a lot of removals going on. They're trying to reclaim. But again, it's ironic because none of the native plants for the coastal, especially the eroding coastal landscape, is as aggressive as the ice plant is. So you won't get as good a result. That's why I'm saying switch over from succulents, because obviously ice plant is a succulent, it's very juicy, but switch over to the creeping grevilleas, and they give you a very effective and non-invasive ground cover.
I have another question, Martin. As you know, all that those great coastal terraces were wilder and coast dairies, etc. They were all farmed. And as they go over to parkland, I guess they're mostly just weeds and invasive species. I mean, yes. What should be there? And do you know if there's any program to
there are so many programs. The Arboretum is involved in several restoration projects. It takes a long time to convert back to a native landscape, and part of the reason is you can put in living plants, you can put in seeds, but part of that recipe for a native landscape is fire. And that means if you want to keep out of the invasives, you need to burn it. So we're talking about controlled burns, and that's going to be our future, is having small controlled burns. And I've done them successfully in several different climates and ecosystems. You have to do it in small enough ways with the right weather conditions. And you can do, if you're not near a forest, if you don't have eucalyptus around, you can do controlled burns in a small way. And the Monterey Bay air quality people have a calendar. You should not be burning anything after April. But it's Monterey Bay air quality. Look up there and you can get permission to burn. But again, there's so many layers of, there's state, there's county, there's municipal, and even neighborhood things about fire. And we're not yet organized. Fires can be dangerous, of course, although in the urban areas, the biggest problem is smoke, not the flames itself. People's houses aren't burning down, but you know, if you're susceptible, you can have some problem with the smoke. But again, restoring native prairie is really, really something, it's a chore, because what keeps prairie grasses going? Fire and grazing animals. So you're not going to have buffalo and antelope in your backyard, probably. Mm-hmm. But you know, grazing animals and fire are what keep down the woody plants and let that coastal prairie really flourish. You can do it bit by bit, especially in a residential sized area.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Martin. That was really a terrific talk. And I want to say again that, as Martin pointed out, the Arboretum does not get support from the university. It really is dependent on our community. I love the Arboretum, and I know a lot of you are members, but if you aren't a member of the Arboretum, this is a way for paying Martin for his talk.
Well, no, it's for the Arboretum membership is such a good deal. With the Arboretum membership, you get free admission, you get 10% off your purchases at not only the gift shop, but also at 10 different landscape businesses in town. And you get reciprocal admission to over 300 gardens across the country. So if you go to Chicago and the Botanic Garden is $30 to get in, you get in free because you're a member here. So we have reciprocal admission with over 300 institutions, and it's a real deal. Your Arboretum membership pays for itself over and over. You get all our communications, our specials, and also most of our events, there's a member price, which is less than the public price. So,
and Barry, I wanted to put in, when in doubt about which plants to put, I go to the Arboretum sale twice a year, and I figure, okay, this plant will work in my yard. So I think that's, when in doubt, get to the Arboretum sale and buy a plant.
But let me tell you, we're not doing the sale anymore because of COVID and other crowd concerns.
Right, yeah.
It got too big. We're selling all year round online. Our inventory is online. Go to the Arboretum website, arboretum@ucsc.edu, and you can see what we're selling. You can see what we have. And now that we have these Master Gardener docents, we have people in person at the shop to help you buy. But remember, the membership is incredibly valued. It's the best value of anything you'll ever join. And just don't get the individual one. Get a family one or go up a couple of grades because there are more perks. The higher your membership level, the more perks you get. It's definitely worth it.
Okay, well, thanks again, Martin. And by the way, if any of you haven't renewed your membership, please do so. You can look in the newsletter or look online to renew your membership. Our membership is holding up amazingly well in this COVID. This is such a wonderful community here. We had a good turnout today, and we will see you all in October or in your local interest group. All right. Bye, everyone.
Thank you, Barry. Bye.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
Let's see what we have here. Actually, I made a mistake there.
Have you stopped recording?